Chapter 12.
If Will Barger was impressed at the sight of so many horses, he gave no sign of it. The small herd had already been penned, and he and Dietz and a man called Chick were quietly separating out horses with a Hick brand on them. Dish Bogat worked the gate between the two corrals, letting Will Barger's horses run through and waving his rope in the face of those he didn't claim. Jake Spoon was nowhere in sight, nor was there any sign of Augustus or the Irishman. The new herd was far too large to pen. Call had always meant to fence a holding pasture for just such an eventuality, but he had never gotten around to it. In the immediate case, it didn't matter greatly. The horses were tired from their long run and could be left to graze and rest. After breakfast, he would send the boy out to watch them. Will Barger paused from his work for a moment to look at the stream of horses trotting past, then went back to his cutting, which was almost done. Since there was already enough help in the pen, there was nothing for Newt to do but stand by the fence and watch. P had already climbed up on what they called the Opry seat, the top rail of the corral, to watch the proceedings. His bay and Newt's mouse, just unsaddled, took a few steps and then lay down and rolled themselves in the dust. Call was not quite ready to rest the mare when Will Barger finished his sorting and came over to the fence. It was her, not the captain, that he had his eye on. "Good morning," he said. "Let's trade. You keep them 38 splendid horses I just sorted out, and I'll take that mean creature you're astraddle of. 38 for one is generous terms in my book." "You keep your book," Call said, not surprised at the offer. P.I. was so startled by what he was hearing that he almost fell off the fence. "You mean you'd give up all them horses for a chance of having a hunk bit out of you?" he asked. He knew men fancied the captain's mare, but anyone that would fancy her to that extent was almost more than he could credit. Dish Bogat walked over, slapping the dust off his chaps with a coiled rope. "Is that your last word on the subject?" Will Barger asked. "I'm offering 38 for one. You won't get a chance like that every day of your life." Dish snorted. He fancied the gray mare himself. "It'd be like trading $50 gold piece for 38 nickels, he said. He was in a foul temper anyway. The minute they had the horses penned, Jake Spoon had unsaddled and walked straight to the dry bean as if that were where he lived. Will Barger ignored him too. "This outfit is full of opinion," he said. "If opinions was money, you'd all be rich." He looked at Call. "I won't trade this mare," Call said. "And that ain't an opinion." "No, it's more like damn hard fact," Will Barger said. "I live on a horse, and yet I ain't had but good ones my whole life." "This is my third," Call said. Will Barger nodded. "Well, sir, I'm obliged to you for getting here on time. It's plain the man you deal with knows where there's a den of thieves." "A big den," Call said. "Well, let's go, Chick. We won't get home unless we start." "You might as well stay for breakfast," Call said. "A couple of more of your horses are on their way." "What are they doing, traveling on 3 legs?" Will Barger asked. "They're with Mr. McCrae," Call said. "He travels at his own pace." "Talk said it too. I don't think we'll wait. Keep them 2 horses for your trouble." "We brought in some nice stock," Call said. "You're welcome to look it over if you're still short." "Not interested. You won't rent pigs, and you won't trade me that mare, so I might as well be on my way." Then he turned to Dish Bogat. "Want a job, son? You look all right to me." "I got a job," Dish said. "Running off Mexican horses isn't a job," Will Barger said. "It's merely a gamble. You've the look of a cowboy, and I'm about to start up the trail with 3,000 head. "So are we," Call said, amused that a man would try to hire a hand out from under him with him sitting there. "Going where?" Will Barger asked. "Going to Montana," Call said. "I wouldn't," Will Barger said. He rode over to the gate and leaned over to open it and rode out, leaving the gate for Chick to close. When Chick tried to lean down and shut the gate, his hat fell off. Nobody walked over to pick it up for him either, and he was forced to dismount, which embarrassed him greatly. Will Barger waited, but he looked impatient. "Well, maybe we'll see up the trail then," he said to Call. "I wouldn't aim for Montana, though. Too far, too cold, full of bears, and I don't know about the Indians." They may be beat, but I wouldn't count on it. You might end up making some a present of a fine herd of beef." "We'll try not to," Carl said. Wilbarger rode off, Chick following at the rear of the small horse herd. As Chick rode past, Dish Boget was greatly tempted to rope him off his horse and box his ears as a means of relieving his feelings about Laurie and Jake Spoon, but the captain was sitting there, so he merely gave Chick a hard stare and let him go. "By gosh, I could eat," P.I. said. "I sure hope Gus ain't lost. If he's lost, I don't know what we'll do for biscuits," he added, since nobody commented on his remark. "You could always get married," Dish observed dryly. "There's plenty of women who can make biscuits." It was not the first time P had had that particular truth pointed out to him. "I know there is," he said. "That don't mean there's one of them that would have me." Dietz gave a rich chuckle. "Well, the old widow Cole'd have you," he said. "She'd be pleased to have you." Then, well aware that the widow Cole was something of a sore spot with P, he walked off toward the house. Mention of Mary Cole made P.I. very uncomfortable. From time to time throughout his life, it had been pointed out to him that he might marry. Gus McCrae was very fond of pointing it out, in fact. But once in a while, even if nobody mentioned one, the thought of a woman entered his head all on its own. And once it came, it usually tended to stay for several hours, filling his noggin like a cloud of gnats. Of course, a cloud of gnats was nothing in comparison to a cloud of Gulf Coast mosquitoes, so the thought of women was not that bothersome, but it was a thought P would rather not have in his head. He had never known what to think about women, and still didn't. But so far as actions went, he was content to take his cue from the captain, whose cue was plain. The captain left them strictly alone and had all the years P had been with him, excepting only one puzzling instance that had occurred years before, which P only remembered once every year or two, usually when he was dreaming. He had gone down to the saloon to get an axe someone had borrowed and not returned, and while he was getting the axe, he heard a young woman crying out words and grievances to someone who was with her in her room. The woman doing the crying was the whore named Maggie, Newt's mother, whom Jake Spoon took such a fancy to later. It was only after P had found the axe and was already halfway home with it that it occurred to him that Maggie had been talking to the captain, and had even called him by his first name, which P had never used in all his years of service. The knowledge that the captain was in the room with the whore struck P hard, sort of like the bullet that had hit him just behind the shoulder blades in the big Indian scrape up by Fort Phantom Hill. When the bullet hit, he felt a solid whack and then sort of went numb in the brain. It was the same with the notion that struck him as he was carrying the axe home from the saloon. Maggie was talking to the captain in the privacy of her room, whereas, so far as he knew, no one had ever heard of the captain doing more than occasionally tipping his hat to a lady if he met one in the street. Overhearing that snatch of conversation was an accident P was slow to forget. For a month or two after it happened, he went around feeling nervous, expecting life to change in some bold way, and yet nothing changed at all. They all soon went up the river to try and catch some bandits raiding out of Chihuahua, and the captain, as far as he could tell, was the same old captain. By the time they came back, Maggie had had her child, and soon after, Jake Spoon moved in with her for a while. Then he left, and Maggie died. Gus went down one day and got Newt from the Mexican family that had taken him upon Maggie's death. The years had gone on passing, most of them slow years, particularly after they quit rangering and went into the horse and cattle business. The only real result of overhearing the conversation was that P was cautious from then on about who he let borrow the axe. He liked life slow and didn't want any more mysteries or sharp surprises. Though he was content to stick with the captain and Gus and do his daily work, he found that the problem of women was one that didn't entirely go away. The question of marriage, about which Dietz felt so free to chuckle, was a persistent one. Gus, who had been married twice and who had whored whenever he could find a whore, was the main reason it was so persistent. Marriage was one of Gus's favorite subjects. When he got to talking about it, the captain usually took his rifle and went for a walk. But by that time, P would usually be comfortable on the porch and a little sleepy with liquor, so he was the one to get the full benefit of Gus's opinions, one of which was that P was just going to waste by not marrying the widow Cole. The fact that P had only spoken to Mary Cole 5 or 6 times in his life, most of them times when she was still married to Josh Cole, didn't mean a thing to a bystander like Gus, or even a bystander like Dietz. Both of them seemed to take it for granted that Mary regarded him as a fit successor to Josh. The thing that seemed to clinch it, in their view, was that while Mary was an unusually tall woman, she was not as tall as P. She had been a good foot taller than Josh Cole, a mild fellow who had been in Pickles Gap buying a milk cow when a bad storm hit. A bolt of lightning fried both Josh and his horse. The milk cow had only been singed, but it still affected her milk. Mary Cole never remarried, but in Gus's view, that was only because P.I. had not had the enterprise to walk down the street and ask her. "Why, Josh was just a half pint," Gus said frequently. "That woman needs a full pint. It'd be a blessing for her to have a man around who could reach the top shelf." P had never considered that height might be a factor in relations such as marriage. After brooding about it for several months, it occurred to him that Gus was tall, too, educated as well. "Hell, you're tall," he said one night. "You ought to marry her yourself. The both of you can read." He knew Mary could read because he had been in church once or twice when the preacher had asked her to read the Psalms. She had a kind of low, scratchy voice, unusual in a woman. Once or twice, listening to it made P feel funny, as if someone was tickling the little hairs at the back of his neck. Gus vehemently denied that he would be a suitable mate for Mary Cole. "Why, no, P. It wouldn't do," he said. "I've done been rung through the ringer of marriage twice. What a widow wants is someone fresh. It's what all women want, widows or not. If a man's got experience, it's bound to be that he got it with another woman. And that don't never sit well. A forthright woman like Mary probably considers that she can give you all the experience you're ever likely to need." To P, it was all just a troublesome puzzle. He could not remember how the subject had come up in the first place, since he had never said a word about wanting to marry. Whatever else it meant leaving the captain. P didn't plan to do that. Of course, Mary didn't live very far away, but the captain always liked to have his men handy in case something came up sudden. There was no knowing what the captain would think if he were to try and marry. One day he pointed out to Gus that he was far from being the only available man in Lonesome Dove. Xavier Wands was available, not to mention Lippy. A number of the traveling men who passed through were surely unmarried. But when he raised the point, Gus just ignored him. Some nights, laying on the porch, he felt a fool for even thinking about such things. And yet think he did. He had lived with men his whole life, rangering and working. During his whole adult life, he couldn't recollect spending 10 minutes alone with a woman. He was better acquainted with Gus's pigs than he was with Mary Cole, and more comfortable with them, too. The sensible thing would be to ignore Gus and Dietz and think about things that had some bearing on his day's work, like how to keep his old boot from rubbing a corn on his left big toe. An army mule had tromped the toe 10 years before. Since then, it had stuck out slightly in the wrong direction, just enough to make his boot rub a corn. The only solution to the problem was to cut holes in his boot, which worked fine in dry weather but had its disadvantages when it was wet and cold. Gus had offered to re-break the toe and set it properly, but P didn't hate the corn that bad. It did seem to him that it was only common sense that the sore toe made more difference in his life than a woman he had barely spoken to, yet his mind didn't see it that way. There were nights when he lay on the porch too sleepy to shave his corn, or even to worry about the problem, when the widow Cole would pop up to the surface of his consciousness like a turtle on the surface of a pond. At such times he would pretend to be asleep, for Gus was so sly he could practically read minds. and would surely tease him if he figured out what he was thinking about Mary and her scratchy voice. Even more persistent than the thought of her reading the Psalms was another memory. One day he had been passing her house when a little thunderstorm swept through the town, scaring the dogs and cats and rolling tumbleweeds down the middle of the street. Mary had hung a washing and was out in her backyard trying to get it in before the rain struck. But the thunderstorm proved too quick for her. Big drops of rain began to splatter in the dust, and the wind got higher, causing the sheets on Mary's clothesline to flap so hard they popped like guns. P had been raised to be helpful, and since it was obvious that Mary was going to have a hard time with the sheets, he started over to offer his assistance. But the storm had a start on both of them, and before he even got there, the rain began to pour down, turning the white dust brown. Most women would have seen at that point that the wash was a lost cause and run for the house, but Mary wasn't running. Her skirt was already so wet it was plastered to her legs, but she was still struggling with one of the flapping sheets. In the struggle, 2 or 3 small garments that she had already gathered up blew out of her hand and across the yard, which had begun to look like a shallow lake. P hurried to retrieve the garments and then help Mary get the wet sheet off the line. She was evidently just doing it out of pure stubbornness, since the sun was shining brightly to the west of the storm and would obviously be available to dry the sheet again in a few minutes. It was P's one close exposure to an aspect of womankind that Gus was always talking about, their penchant for flying directly in the face of reason. Mary was as wet on the top as on the bottom, and the flapping sheet had knocked one of the combs out of her hair, causing it to come loose. The wash was as wet as it had been before she hung it up in the first place, and yet she wasn't quitting. She was taking clothes off the line that would just have to be hung back on in 15 minutes, and P was helping her do it as if it all made some sense. While he was steadying the clothesline, he happened to notice something that gave him almost as hard a jolt as the bolt of lightning that had killed Josh Cole. The clothes he had rescued were undergarments. White bloomers of the sort that it was obvious Mary was wearing beneath the skirt that was so wet against her legs. P was so shocked that he almost dropped the underpants back in the mud. She was bound to think it bold that he would pick up her undergarments like that, yet she was determined to have the sheets off the line, and all he could do was stand there numb with embarrassment. It was a blessing that the rain soon began to pour off his hat brim in streams right in front of his face, making a little waterfall for him to hide behind until the ordeal ended. With the water running off his hat, he only caught blurred glimpses of what was going on. He could not judge to what extent Mary had been shocked by his helpful but thoughtless act. To his surprise, nothing terrible happened. When she finally had the sheet under control, Mary took the bloomers from him as casually as if they were handkerchiefs or table napkins or something. To his vast surprise, she seemed to be rather amused at the sight of him standing there with a stream of water pouring off his hat and falling just in front of his nose. "P, it's a good thing you know how to keep your mouth shut," she said. "If you opened it right now, you'd probably drown. Many thanks for your help." She was the kind of forthright woman who called men by their first names, and she was known to salt her speech rather freely with criticism. "We've the Lord to thank for this bath," she said. "I personally didn't need it, but I'm bound to say it might work an improvement where you're concerned. You ain't as bad looking as I thought, now that you're nearly clean." By the time she got to her back porch, the rain was slacking and the sun was already striking little rainbows through the sparkle of drops that still fell. P had walked on home, the water dripping more slowly from his hat. He never mentioned the incident to anyone, knowing it would mean unmerciful teasing if it ever got out, but he remembered it. When he lay on the porch half drunk, it floated up in his mind. Things got mixed into the memory that he hadn't even known he was noticing, such as the smell of Mary's wet flesh. He hadn't meant to smell her. He hadn't made any effort to. And yet the very night after it happened, the first thing he remembered was that Mary had smelled different from any other wet thing he had ever smelled. He could not find a word for what was different about Mary's smell. Maybe it was just that, being a woman. She smelled cleaner than most of the wet creatures he came in contact with. It had been more than a year since the rainstorm, and yet Mary's smell was still part of the memory of it. He also remembered how she seemed to bulge out of her corset at the top and the bottom both. It was not every night that he remembered Mary, though. Much of the time he found himself wondering about the generalities of marriage. The principal aspect he worried over most was that marriage required men and women to live together. He had tried many times to envision how it would be to be alone at night under the same roof with a woman, or to have one there at breakfast and supper. What kind of talk would a woman expect? What kind of behavior? It stumped him. He couldn't even make a guess. Once in a while it occurred to him that he could tell Mary he would like to marry her, but didn't consider himself worthy to live under the same roof with her. If he put it right, she might take a liberal attitude and allow him to continue to live down the street with the boys, that being what he was used to. He would plan, of course, to make himself available for chores when she required him. Otherwise, life could go on in its accustomed way. He was even tempted to sound out Gus on the plan. Gus knew more things about marriage than anyone else, but every time he planned to bring it up, he either got sleepy first or decided at the last second he'd better keep quiet. If the plan was ridiculous in the eyes of an expert, then P wouldn't know what to think. And besides, Gus would never let up teasing. They were all scattered around the table, finishing one of Bowles' greasy breakfasts, when they heard the sound of horses in the yard. The next minute, Augustus trotted up and dismounted with the two Irishmen a few yards behind him. Instead of being bareback, the Irishmen were riding big silver-studded Mexican saddles and driving 8 or 10 skinny horses before them. When they reached the porch, they just sat on their horses, looking unhappy. Dish Bogat had not really believed that there were any Irishmen down in Mexico, and when he stepped out on the back porch and saw them, he burst right out laughing. Newt felt a little sorry for the two of them, but he had to admit they were a comical sight. The Mexican saddles were all clearly meant for men with longer legs. Their feet did not come anywhere near the stirrups. Even so, the Irishman seemed disinclined to dismount. Augustus jerked the saddle off his tired horse and turned him loose to graze. "Get down, boys," he said to the Irishman. "You're safe now as long as you don't eat the cooking. This is what we'll call home." Alan O'Brien had both hands around the big Mexican saddle horn. He had been holding onto it so tightly for the last 2 hours that he was not sure he could turn it loose. He looked down with apprehension. "I'd not realized how much taller a horse is than a mule," he said. "Seems a long ways down." Dish regarded the remark as the most comical he had ever heard. It had never occurred to him that there would be such a thing as a grown man who didn't know how to dismount from a horse. The sight of the two Irishmen stuck with their short legs dangling down the sides of the horses struck him as so funny that he doubled over with laughter. "I guess we'll just have to build him a ladder, by God," he said when he could catch his breath. Augustus, too, was mildly amused by the Irishman's ignorance. "Why, boys, you just have to flop over and drop," he said. Alan O'Brien accomplished the dismounting with no real trouble, but Sean was reluctant to drop once he flopped over. He hung from the saddle horn for several seconds, which puzzled the horse so that it began to try and buck a little. It was too thin and too tired to do much, but Sean did get jerked around a little, a sight so funny that even Call laughed. Alan O'Brien, once safe on the ground, immediately joined the laughter out of relief. Sean finally dropped and stood glaring at his brother. "Well, I don't see Jake. That figures," Augustus said, taking himself a big dipper of water and swishing a few mouthfuls around and spitting them out to clear the dust from his throat. He then offered the dipper to Alan O'Brien, who imitated the swishing and spitting, thinking it must be a custom of the new country he found himself in. "You took your time, I see," Call said. "I was about to start back with a burial party." "Shucks! Bringing these boys in was such a light task, I went over to Sabinas and stopped off at the whorehouse." "That explains the saddles," Call said. "Yes, and the horses, too. All the bandits was dead drunk by the time we got there. These Irish boys can't maintain much of a pace riding bareback, so we helped ourselves to a few saddles and the best of the nags. Them horses wouldn't make good soap, Dish said, looking at the horses Augustus had brought back. If I wasn't so hungry, I'd argue the point, Augustus said. Bile them horses for a week or two, and they'll produce a fine soap. Young Sean O'Brien could not conceal his disappointment with America. If this is America, where's the snow, he asked, to everyone's surprise. His image of the new country had been strongly influenced by a scene of Boston Harbor in winter that he had seen in an old magazine. There had been lots of snow, and the hot backyard he found himself in was nothing like what he had expected. Instead of ships with tall masts, there was just a low adobe house, with lots of old saddles and pieces of rotting harnesses piled under a little shed at one corner. Worse still, he could not see a spot of green anywhere. The bushes were gray and thorny, and there were no trees at all. No, son, you overshot the snow. What we have down here is sand. Carl felt his impatience rising. The night had been far more successful than he could have hoped. They could keep the best horses and sell the rest. The profits would easily enable them to hire a crew and outfit a wagon for the trip north. Then all they would have to do would be to gather the cattle and brand them. If everyone would work like they should, it could all be accomplished in 3 weeks, and they could be on the trail by the 1st of April. None too soon, considering the distance they had to go. The problem would be getting everyone to work like they should. Jake was already off with his whore, and Augustus hadn't had breakfast. You men go eat, Carl said to the Irishman. Having rescued them, he could do no less than feed them. Alan O'Brien was looking dejectedly at the few buildings that made up Lonesome Dove. Is this all there is to town, he asked. Yes, and it's worse than it looks, Augustus said. To the embarrassment of everyone, Sean O'Brien began to cry. It had been an extremely tense night, and he hadn't expected to survive it. All during the ride, he had expected to fall off his horse and become paralyzed. He associated paralysis with falls because a cousin of his had fallen off a cottage he was thatching and had been paralyzed ever since. The horse Sean had been given seemed to him at least as tall as a cottage, and he felt he had good reason to worry. He had spent a long boat ride growing more and more homesick for the green land he had left. When they were put ashore at Veracruz, he had not been too disappointed. It was only Mexico they were in, and no one had ever told him Mexico was green. But now they were in America, and all he could see was dust and low bushes with thorns, and almost no grass at all. He had expected coolness and dew and green grass on which to stretch out for a long nap. The bare, hot yard was a cruel letdown, and besides, Sean was an easy weeper. Tears ran out of his eyes whenever he thought of anything sad. His brother Alan was so embarrassed by the sight of Sean's tears that he walked straight into the house and sat down at the table. They had been asked to eat, and if Sean preferred to stand in the yard crying, that was his problem. Dish concluded that the young Irishman was probably crazy. Only someone crazy would break out crying in front of several grown men. Augustus saved the day by going over and taking Sean by the arm. He spoke kindly to him and led him toward the house. Let's go eat, son, he said. It won't look quite so ugly on a full stomach. But where's the grass? Sean asked, snuffling. Dish Bogat let out a whoop. I guess he was meaning to graze, he said. Why, no, Dish, Augustus said. He was just reared in a place where the grass covers the ground, not in no desert like you. I was reared on the Matagorda, Dish said. We got grass knee-high over there. Gus, we need to talk a minute, Carl said. But Augustus had already led the boy through the door, and Carl had followed him in. A surprised Bolivar watched the Irishman put away sow belly and beans. He was so startled by their appearance that he picked up a shotgun that he kept by the cook stove and put it across his lap. It was his goat gun, a rusty 10 gauge, and he liked to have it handy if anything unusual happened.
Hello, sir?
I hope you don't decide to shoot that thing off in here, Augustus said. It'd take a wall out if you did, not to mention us. I don't shoot yet, Bull said sullenly, keeping his options open. Carl waited until Augustus filled his plate, since there would be no getting his attention until he had food before him. The young Irish boy had stopped crying and was putting away beans faster even than Augustus. Starvation was probably all that was wrong with him. "I'm going to see if I can hire some hands," Carl said. "You better move them horses this afternoon." "Move them where?" Augustus asked. "Upriver. As far as you want," Carl said. "These Irishmen have fine voices," Augustus remarked. "It's a pity there ain't two more of them and we'd have a barbershop quartet." "It would be a pity if you lost them horses while I'm off hiring hands, too," Carl pointed out. "Oh, you mean you want me to sleep out on the ground for several nights just to keep Pedro from stealing these horses back? I'm out of practice sleeping on the ground." "What was you planning to sleep on the way to Montana?" Carl asked in turn. "We can't take the house with us. There ain't many hotels between here and there." "I hadn't been planning on going to Montana," Augustus said. "That's your plan. I may come if I feel like it, or you may change your mind. I know you never have changed your mind about anything yet, but there's a first time for everything." "You'd argue with a stump," Carl said. "You just watch them horses. We may never get that lucky again." Carl saw there was no point in losing any more time. If Augustus was not of a mind to be serious, nothing could move him. "Jake did come back, didn't he?" Augustus asked. "His horse is here," Carl said. "I guess he probably come with it. You think he'll work once we start?" "No, and I won't either," Augustus said. "You better hire these Irish boys while you got the chance." "That's work we're looking for," Allen said. "What we don't know we'll gladly learn." Carl refrained from comment. Men who didn't know how to get on and off a horse would not be much use around a cow outfit. "Where are you going hiring?" Augustus asked. "I might go to the Rainies," Carl said. "Many boys as they got, they ought to be able to spare a few." "I sparked Maud Rainey once upon a time," Augustus said, tilting back in his chair. "If we hadn't had the Comanches to worry with, I'd expect I'd have married her. Her name was Grove before she was married. She lays them boys like hens lay eggs, don't she?" Carl left to keep from having to talk all day. Dietz was catching a short nap on the back porch, but he sat up when Carl came out. Dish Boget and the boy were roping low bushes, Dish teaching the boy a thing or two about the craft of roping. That was good, since nobody around the Hat Creek outfit could rope well enough to teach him anything. Carl himself could rope in an emergency, and so could P, but neither of them were ropers of the first class. "Practice up, boys," he said. "As soon as we gather some cattle, there's going to be a pile of roping to do." Then he caught his second-best horse, a sorrel gelding called Sunup, and headed northeast toward the brush country.